Welcome back. Today we're going to be having a look at the options we have for axes in Vuesz, how we can control where the axis is and its appearance. This is an important part of making an easy to interpret and enjoyable to look at graphic. And so with that, let's just jump right in. We're going to just work with this basic bar chart that we've seen before, where we're plotting the number of people that have a particular degree post-high school. I've already worked a little bit on the y-axis, and that's because we covered this before when we had our video on how to make a bar chart. So let's look at the x-axis and use that to frame how we think about the control we have over axes in Vuesz. Because we're interested in the x-axis, then over in editing, I just need to click on X, and this will bring up everything of interest for us. Probably the first thing that you'll notice is that there's no title. And so that is what Vuesz calls the label. So let's go ahead and just call this people. Or if we want to be a little bit more precise, number of people. We've set the min and the max to auto, and I think that especially when we have a bar chart, Vuesz is pretty good at knowing that the minimum should be 0. But let's say that you weren't confident about that. You could just type in 0. Of course, you can type in anything you want. You could have 1,000, which is not where we should start. You could even have negative 1,000, which also won't make sense because we don't have data past below 0. So let's just set this at 0 for right now. The maximum is also set to auto. I think right now that does a fairly good job. We could of course change this if we wanted. We could have this be, for instance, 10,000, and it won't show enough. 100,000 probably still doesn't quite show enough. And then 1,000,000, quite a bit too large. And so how about we check 0.3? No, 0.2. So this is 200,000. One thing you'll notice right away is that Vuesz uses the notation 2e to the 5th, so that's 2 times 10 to the 5th, that's 10,000. And so that's kind of convenient for us. How about 1.5? Okay. If you don't like any of these, of course, and you like the way it looked, you can go back to auto, where it just picks the size for you. We also have an option for log scale, and so rather than being linear, this could be in log format. I think that for bar charts, this is especially problematic because 0 doesn't really have a great meaning when we're working with log. But we might find that we need this when we're working with scatter plots or things like that. Our mode is numeric, although we could also tell it that the data we're giving it is date, time, or their labels. And we've seen labels before, which is exactly what we did to get the labels here instead of numbers on the y-axis. So if I click on Y, you'll see our mode is labels. Again, you can look at the video where we made a bar chart in Vuesz in order to see how that works. If we go back to X, we also have scale. What would happen if I typed in 10? You'll notice that I've basically multiplied every number along the x-axis by 10. Let me change that again. This is a feature that can be useful to us in case we wanted to have, instead of number of people, let's say thousands of people. Now what I would do is scale this by 0.001. Now I have 25,000, 50,000, 75,000, 100,000, 125,000. And so this scale can be convenient for us in order to reorder what we want things to be, or to change the numbers so that we don't have to have so many complex and scientific notation numbers there. I'm actually going to say hundreds of thousands, just so that we can have a look at something else later. So hundreds of thousands of people. And then of course what I need to do is add 2 more zeros here. The direction of this axis is horizontal. I could make it be the vertical axis if I wanted, and now I've moved it up and down along here. So essentially, even though Vuesz is called this X and Y, it doesn't, this is just convention. This is our horizontal axis by default and our vertical axis by default. If I went into Y, you could see that it had defaulted to vertical, and I make this horizontal, that could also work. Okay, but again, these are the defaults. I have the min and max position, and so I could change the direction of this if I wanted. I could put the min position at 1 and the max position at 0, and the bars will run backwards. I can of course put whatever number I want in here, and really what this is referring to is the line that is the y-axis where the border ends back in graph. So under the main menu of graph, I have a border, the left margin of 1.2 inches. That's where 0 is. And then I have a border on the right, which is 0.2 centimeters, and that's where 1 is. And so I can pick numbers that are between those if I want. What if the min position wasn't 1, which is over here, but 0.75? You'll see it's moved in some, because again, I'm telling it a position between here and over here. And of course I could make these be beyond those limits. So let's go back to normal for a second, where the min position starts at the left border and then the max position ends over here at the right border. What if instead of 0.1, or instead of 0, I had minus 0.1? It will just shift the bars over and have the x-axis start inside of that left margin. Okay, so for the most part, you probably want the defaults, which is the min position at 0, the max position at 1. There's also the axis position. We're saying, where is that drawn? Right now it's 0, and that means we're thinking now of drawing this because it's horizontal. 0 is where the bottom margin ends, and 1 is where the top margin ends. So if I simply type in 1 here, it will move the axis to the top. And so if you want to have the axis with all its labels at the top of the chart, this is how you would accomplish that. I can't see the labels because the margin is not big enough. So let's make the top margin the same as the bottom margin, 1.2 centimeters. And now you'll see that it has drawn the x-axis where the top margin ends, because we've told it that the axis position is at 1. I could of course put this somewhere else, like halfway, if you wanted that to be halfway, and there are reasons why that might be. But how about for now we just put this at 1. I think that can often work for bar charts because we read again sort of top left to bottom right, and so all the information that we're interested in is now here. We're now done essentially with the properties window. We're not going to use the match feature here. So let's go over to formatting window. We can see that we have under the main window that we could hide this. So we could have done all the work and then decided, oh, I don't really need an axis. I need to plot against it, but I don't want to show it. You do that just by clicking hide. And now that axis is gone. Auto range means to next tick. That means that basically you want to draw to the next tick mark. But I could say the next tick mark plus 15%, and then it'll add a little bit at the end. So if you like having a little bit of buffer, and this especially comes into play when we're thinking about using things like scatter plots, then you can add it in here instead of needing to type it in to the range. But we'll say next tick mark. Another one would be exact, and now it would end exactly where the data ends. I think that to me is not great for bar charts because then I'm always nervous about whether I cut off this. And so I think having a little bit of buffer is actually pretty nice so that you can tell that we didn't cut off this. So even though I said next tick mark worked well, maybe 10% buffer would work. I don't know. You can decide. But we'll use next tick mark this time. Auto mirror. You can see that I have an axis here, but there's nothing down here. And a lot of times we do see our axes repeated with the tick marks. And if I want that, I just check auto mirror. I oftentimes think that's redundant and I don't really need it, so I never use it, but that's okay. If I say reflect, you'll see that what it's done is it's taken all the markings and labels and moved it to the other side. Sometimes this is what you want. You need it, this axis, to be in a different position, but then reflected. For instance, let's go back and say our axis position is at 0.5, but I don't want the numbers on the bottom, I want them on the top. I could click reflect, and then I have that. And then outer tick marks. If I uncheck this, then the tick marks move to the inside of the plot. I tend to like the outer tick marks because right now the tick marks are starting to run into the data, and that can often happen. So let's just go ahead and have outer tick marks. The next is the axis line. Right now I have the axis color set to gray, but it could be something like red. And now you'll see that I have a red line for my axis. Let's go ahead and stick with gray for right now. We have a width of 1 point. This could be much thicker, 1 3-point, and now I have a very thick line. This could even be in other units like centimeters. And so now I could have a really thick line, 0.1 centimeters, 0.2 centimeters. I think for me, I kind of like the look of the 1 point thickness, so I use that quite a bit, that or 2 point, half a point sometimes if I want really thin lines. The line style is solid, which is what we're used to seeing, but there's no reason it has to be that way. I could have a dashed line for my axis, and there you have it. Again, there might be a reason you want that, but I think most of the time what we're going to want is a solid line. We could make this partially transparent. Maybe there's some information that's behind the axis that we want to be able to see, and now I could see that. Hard to see on this plot, but that is what it would allow us to do. I think most of the time that's not what we want, so we'll just set the transparency to 0. Rather than hiding the entire axis, I could just hide the line. And now we have sort of that look that we've seen before in Excel, where there isn't a line here, but there are tick marks. So if you like that look, that's how you accomplish it. Moving into the axis label, this is what controls the appearance of the title, right? So remember under X, we had written the title under label. So now we're formatting that label. You can change the font type. I like this Avenir, but you know, sometimes you like Times, or maybe you like Courier, if you like that sort of like typewritten look. I'm going to use this Avenir. I like it. It's sort of a geometric modern. I think it looks nice. Your opinion, you may think differently, but yes. You could make this bigger if you wanted. You could make it smaller if you wanted. I have it set to basically the same size as everything else, and so we'll just use that 10 point. Like anything else, you can change the color. So this could also be red if we wanted it to be. But let's just go ahead and stick with the same gray for now. We could change the formatting. It could be italics, it could be bold, it could be underlined. Hide, meaning I could just hide the text if I wanted to. I could put it at the edge, and by at the edge, what we mean is like at the edge of this plot area, this page. And so now, even if I go back and I increase the top margin, let's say this was now 2 centimeters, it's going to keep it up at the edge of the page. And so instead, if I want, I can say not at the edge, and then it'll put it near the axis. How near depends on the label offset. So I could type in 10 point, and you'll see that moves it. I could type in minus 10 point, and you'll see it doesn't recognize that. And so the smallest we're going to go is 0 point. I could rotate this if I wanted. So there's 45 degrees. I don't know why we would want that. I think we've talked about the fact that if we're rotating text, a lot of times that's a poor idea. So let's just leave it at 0. And then we can change the axis position. I could have this be at minimum, and now it's going to line it up right at the minimum where we've placed the minimum of the x-axis. I think that works well, especially for bar charts where this is such a strong vertical line that it's nice that the title can align on there. All right, what's next? Instead of formatting the label, we can format the numbers that appear at the tick marks. That's what Vuesz is calling the tick labels. Again, I have Avenir as a font, I have the size as 9, I have the color as gray. All of those could be changed as we saw before. They could be italic, bold, or underlined, or even hidden. And you'll see that now the reason why this can't get closer is because the numbers are in the way. The numbers also run into these tick marks, and the reason is that we don't have enough offset. What if I set this offset to 5 point? You'll see it moves these numbers up, and then I don't run them into here as much. And so you can play around with this to see how much offset you think you need in order to get it to look right. It's interesting because if this had been set, the x-axis, where the axis position was at 0, I wouldn't need that, and the offset of 0 works quite well. And that's because this is sort of what Vuesz normally expects you to have. And so let's just go ahead and put it back up top, and just realize that when we do that, we're going to have to control our tick offset. Okay, what else have we not considered? This could be rotated just as we saw before. Again, I don't think that's a great idea, and we should try to avoid that if we can. We have scale. This is just like what we saw before, actually. So it's a different way to accomplish the same scaling that we saw over here. So if I wanted to undo this, I could set that to scale of 1, Or of course, I could multiply this by 100,000. And now we're back to what we had before. And so I think the thing here is just to realize that you have two options in two places that you can do the scaling. The last thing we haven't talked about is format. Under format, we have several different options. Let's start at the bottom because I think this is the one that I use most commonly. And it basically says that we should have two decimal places always shown. If you look at what we have here, I have 0, 0.25, 0.5, and so I have an uneven number of decimal places. I don't really like the way that looks, and so I like to enforce an even number. Now I'm showing 2. I could, of course, show 3. I could, of course, show 1. And I don't like this because this is actually 2.5 instead of 0.2. And so make sure you pick a number that lets you show what's useful. And we'll come to how to control what these numbers are and what the spacing is in the next tab of the formatting, which will happen right now. So we've looked at how to control the labels for the tick marks. Next is how do we control the major ticks? If I click on here, again, I have control over the color, the width, the style, the transparency. I could choose to show them or not. If I click this, you'll notice there's still a tick mark there because I haven't controlled the minor tick marks yet, just the major ones. I can change the length, so this could be like 10 point if I want them to be real long. I could have it be 1 if I want them to be very nubby. I think I had this defaulting to 4, and also that might be why the offset for the tick being 4 point made a lot of sense in terms of how it looked. I chose 6 tick marks, and so I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so what Vuesz has done is tried to divide up its auto range into 6 different lines. Now it doesn't always mean that you're going to get 6. You know, if I put in 7, it's going to give me 7. If I put in 8, you'll notice it didn't change from what 7 was. And so this, when you put in the number, is really a suggestion. And Vuesz will be trying to make sense of it and try to give you something that seems logical in terms of the number of tick marks you actually get out. So be aware of that. That's sort of a suggestion. Now 6 I don't like because I don't like this as 0.25. In this case it kind of works out because this is 0.05, 0.1, 0.15, but it can be a little tricky. If this had been divided in half, then that would be 0.125, and it just, I don't know, even though a quarter does sort of make sense at times as a division, to me I don't like it all the time. And so maybe instead of 6 I could have 3. Now I have not as many labels, but it starts to make more sense to me what's going on in terms of 0, half, 1. Again, you may have a different opinion, and you can change the number that you see in order to achieve that. I'm going to leave it at this. And one thing that's happened is that now I don't need so many decimal places, right? I just need 1 actually. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to change my formatting here to just show 1 decimal place. Then I'm going to go back. I also don't like how now the axis has made this so that I can't tell whether I'm cutting this off or not. And so let's just go ahead and say that this is 125,000. Okay, why couldn't I type in 125,000? Because the scale here is scaling that number. So this really should be 1.5 or 1.25, sorry. Okay, and so there is a difference about why you would put the scale here. The scale here affects your min and max values. Using the scale over here does not. So if I wanted to show the same thing and I set this scale to 1 and this scale to 1 e to the minus 5, I get the same numbers, but I don't see the same bar because now this does have to be 125,000 in order to see the same. The scale over here affects only the scale along the x-axis. The scale over here affects how it's plotted along that x-axis. All right, so just for ease of using this, let's go back and say that this is 1 e to the minus 5, and then this is just 1.25. And we know that that means it's 100,000. Again, you can put the scale over here, or you can put the scale over here. Back to the tick marks. We have 3. We've changed it so that now I just have the 1 decimal place. Something else you could do though is you could specify manual tick marks. Maybe for some reason I want a tick mark at like 0.1. And then I also want a tick mark at 0.3. And then I want a tick mark at 1.5, which we can't see. So how about 1.1? And so I can also just type in what the manual ticks are, and that overrides having 3. If I have nothing written in the manual tick marks, it goes back to what evenly I should have divided given by the number that I want. What's next? How about minor tick marks? That's the next thing on this list. So if I go over 1, I will get to minor tick marks. They are gray. You can see I've set them a little bit thinner. If I wanted to increase the consistency, I could just make them the same, but I actually kind of like having this contrast between the minor and the major tick marks. So I'll leave that at 0.5. You can change the solid, the transparency. I could hide them if I didn't want them there. I could change the length so that these were long, just as long. But again, I kind of like having the contrast in length, so I'm going to put that back to 2. The number is 20, which here is working out. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I go basically in units of 0.05 all the way along here. It kind of makes sense, but actually I think I just want one in the middle. And the easiest way to do that is to think like I have 3 tick marks here, so I need twice as many if I want one in the middle. So I'll say 6, and now I basically have 6 minor tick marks. If I were to hide the major tick marks, you'd see that the minor ones remain. So there are all 6. And now basically I have 0, 0.25, 0.5. And so if I like dividing things up into quarters, let's say, this is how I tend to do it. I have the major tick marks be half and the minor tick marks be quarters. Okay, what's left here on the axis? We're almost done. I have 2 more options. One is the major grid lines, what they're calling just grid lines. By default, Vuesz hides these, but if you want to show them, you just click unhide. And you can see what it's doing is putting grid lines exactly where the major tick marks are. And that would happen even if we had manual tick marks. So we can go back to like 0.1 and 0.3 and 1.1. Don't need a comma at the end. And now it's put the major grid lines where those major tick marks are. Go ahead and delete that so that we get our evenly spaced ones. You can control the color, you can control the width. Since these are associated with the major tick marks, I'd probably make them the same width. I think the dotted adds a contrast that I don't need, so I'd probably make this solid if I were going to use them. You can control their transparency, and then you have on top. On top means that we're always going to put it as the last thing we draw so that it goes on top of the data. So if I click that, you can see now they appear. If I click off, now they're behind the data. So that controls whether we see them on top of the data or not. I think sometimes this can be really nice, maybe not for here, but let's imagine that you had discrete values where they come in blocks of like half and 1. A trick that can look good then is to put them on top and make this white, and then it divides up these bars for you. Again, here, I don't think it really works, but that's something that can be nice down the line. So I'm going to move that to be not on top. Then the minor grid lines, those are the ones that are associated with the minor tick marks. So if I show those, you'll see now I have lines where the minor tick marks are. I could set those to be the same color if I wanted, and I think a lot of times actually this gray is too dark and it's distracting, but that's fine. We're not trying to make something that looks amazing, we're just trying to see what's going on and what we can control. They're black right now because I just spelled gray. And so there we go. Now we have something where we have changed the axes. Again, I don't actually like the way this looks. It's close, but I wouldn't really have these grid lines. So if it were me, I would at least go back in and go to the grid lines and say, let's hide the major and the minor. And again, you can see that the minor grid lines, which are not hidden, but the major ones are, still appear because we have minor tick marks underneath this as well. But let's hide both of those. And now we do have something that I think, at least from an axis standpoint, looks somewhat reasonable. It could probably still be improved, but It's okay. The point of this was to explore the different options that we have in Vuesz for controlling the appearance of the axes, and you can see that there are many. This is part of the reason why Vuesz is a little harder to use than Excel, because we have so many different options. On the other hand, having so many different options that are just present and easy to get at within this GUI makes it a lot easier for us to control the appearance and to make something look exactly how we want it to look. Again, there's a trade-off between flexibility, which Vuesz has more than Excel, and usability. And so Excel is a little bit easier to click something and get a plot that we recognize as something that looks nice. In Vuesz, you might have to work a little bit more, but once you understand what you're trying to do, it's much easier to realize a custom looking plot. And eventually we'll see how to set up things so that you have a default set of options that gives you a plot that's similar to what you like seeing most of the time. This is something I've done. And once you understand the design choices you're trying to make, then it makes sense to set up those defaults so that you're kind of ready to go, and it minimizes the amount of time you have to play around with these options in Vuesz. But for now, hopefully this video has helped you understand what you can change in Vuesz and why you might change it and where they are located for controlling the appearance of axes. And so with that, go out and have fun making some nice looking axes, and axes that look exactly how you want them